your training is probably what you're currently doing is probably taking you further away from elite performance instead of nudging you toward it. And that's why a lot of these athletes need to go in and do some of this general stuff, like the general work capacity stuff, or to build up their movement literacy and their sensory motor competencies that are going to transfer out elsewhere.
I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow.
Welcome to the Undercurrent podcast, and I'm very excited today to be having a conversation with my good friend, Matt Cooper. And Matt has, you hear me call him Coop probably, so Coop has a very holistic approach on athletic performance, factoring in energy production, biomechanics, neurology, fascial and tissue health, and putting it together in ways that I think are very unique and effective. And he has some really cool methods and really effective frameworks for how to optimize performance across all of these domains. And based on many of the conversations he and I have had over the years, I'm very excited for this one because I think it's going to be very informative, fascinating, and I'm excited to dive in with you here. So Coop, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, man, thanks for having me. And I think that, every Cooper out there, it's like obliged, you got to go by Coop, right? I don't know any person with the last name Cooper that hasn't been called Coop at least at some point.
It's got a nice ring to it, so I like that. And well, I guess sometimes if people hear me call you Matt, that's your first name, but often it's Coop.
Yeah, it's Matt Cooper, so it's like one step away from John Smith. It's like the second most common of these names.
Well, you wear it very well, and I think people will know you by the end of this for your knowledge and your take on athletic performance and human optimization. So you make a name for yourself beyond just the name on your birth certificate.
There we go. We'll try. Keep the dream alive.
So there's a lot of different topics where you have deep expertise and knowledge that I want to dive into. Before we do that, can you just let people know a little bit about yourself, your backstory, and kind of how you got to be where you are today?
Yeah, definitely. So I played sports growing up, and I always enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun doing it. For some reason, I wasn't into putting in the extra work at the time to like make it, get as much out of it as I could. I was just similar to school. I always got good grades without trying too hard. It's the same with sports. I always started without really, for the most part, and did well without trying too hard. But much to the dismay of my father, I never, tried as hard as I probably could or should have. And then what's funny now is I sort of like most people start playing sports and then they quit and they don't have that activity in their life anymore. I'm kind of the reverse, right? I did play it, but I just really didn't put all my eggs in that basket. And then later on in adulthood, I'm like living out that sports career that I never had by helping other people. Anyways, yeah. So, I was in college going to school for something unrelated. I actually got a degree in communications and journalism, writing for the media, and then realized I was really passionate about health and fitness at that time. And then what started as me search turned into research, and other people kind of were asking me, for help. And I found that I enjoyed helping them. And then that naturally, eventually took me to where I'm at now, which is helping all kinds of people, really, like a lot of pro and developing athletes, some people with chronic conditions, some everyday people as well. And just helping them with basically, marrying integrative health with strength and conditioning and rehab.
Awesome. And who are some of the biggest influences, or among different mentors or different systems that you've learned? And I know you've done some cool trainings and have been able to combine some interesting things in unique ways. What are some of the biggest influences on you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I probably, for my own betterment, didn't really, I have gone through traditional schooling, like I have a CSCS and things like that for for training and rehab, stuff like that. But I was always a guy who just saw someone doing something really well and then just kind of got on the phone and called them or went and visited them. So you being an example of that, and NeuFit, obviously, and that whole, not just the technology, but also the training system around it. I would say Marv Marinovich, Nick Kurson, that whole training family. Nick really opened a lot of, to give him credit, Nick Speed of Sport, he really opened my eyes to a lot of things and just sort of a new way of doing things. And then from there, that kind of lit the fuse on me continuing to seek that out, right? So people like Nadi Aguilar, Functional Patterns, Gary Gray and the Gray Institute, Todd Wright, a mutual acquaintance of ours, people like Fabrice Gauthier and the team at WAF, of course, Dominic Soares, other people too, Rick Stanzi. There's like, it's like too many to list. And then on the health and nutrition side of things, it's similar as well, because I originally was following a lot of mainstream health and fitness advice, wound up making me really sick, actually. And so I was sort of forced to like seek out other solutions. And then again, that whole me search turns to research thing, that happened again, right? So on that end of things, I would say, Dr. Ray Peat, Nicholas Simpson, again, the Canadian strength and conditioning coach, sports scientist, Mike Maddox, who's also a pretty amazing equipment, sports technology equipment inventor. They've all been pretty instrumental in that regard. Ryan Freisinger, of course, who we were talking about as well.
Yeah, awesome. So I know you're one of the most well-read and researched people that that I get to interact with, and it was good to hear that. So thanks for sharing that. And you've definitely done the work and learned a lot. Learned a lot from others, implemented it, found a lot of what doesn't work, what does work, and tweaked accordingly. And I kind of like your framework on that. So let's go into some of what you're actually up to here. And I would be interested to hear your thoughts on something that we've talked about on this podcast before. And we've got a couple episodes sprinkled in where we talk more about athletic performance, and we have, and I also wrote about it in the book. Thank you for the product placement there with the book in your background.
I'm your regular old Vanna White.
That's right. So I appreciate that. And there I wrote about that concept of the pyramid of athletic performance, not unique to me or us by any means, but the concept that you have to have a base foundation of movement proficiency. You have to have mobility and coordination. You have to be able to get into the positions that you need. You have to also have the energy to fuel whatever it is that you're doing. Only then does it make sense to start looking at building strength and speed and then adding skill on top of that. So there's this type of foundation. How do you think about the various traits and qualities or elements of performance, and then use that in terms of prioritizing, choosing what to work on, finding points of emphasis for your athletes that you're training? How do you kind of look at the landscape of traits and qualities and figure out how to plan your approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's almost like I got a few kind of different models that feed into each other. I would say I hold the same pyramid that you do there, right? Where you're talking about like kinetics and kinematics, or, how someone moves, right? Their movement literacy, and then combining that with things like load and velocity, or the kinematic part of the equation, and the things that make that up, right? Whether, and underpin that, whether it's like the structure, right? Or whether it's something underlying neurological, like proprioception. There's a lot that goes into that. So I would say, to answer the second question first, I do something called like limit or bridge training. So it's like if you're doing a needs analysis, looking at what someone needs for a sport, or their day-to-day function, and you see what their biggest gaps are, and then you try to attack those first, right, while not neglecting anything else. And then over time, you can start to, as you close, you fill one pothole, okay, then that priority is covered. You go to the next biggest one. It's a little bit of an overly simplistic way to explain that type of programming, but hopefully that kind of paints a picture that makes sense. I definitely am one of those guys that tries to improve, biomechanics and baseline neurological function for higher movement quality and body literacy, and do things like increase or progress with load and velocity and things like that accordingly, as opposed to traditional models where they're trying to just fit everybody right into these classic patterns of, a barbell back squat, a bench press. And we do some, we definitely lift, right? I'm just saying that instead of looking at things from a movement lens first, they try to like fit everybody into that traditional box. From kind of how we look at health and human performance, I stole this model from Aaron Davis and the guys at Patrick Estes, the guys at Evolve Health and Performance, but like an energy structure function model. I'm not saying I have the same methods that they do, because I don't think we overlap everywhere in that regard, but just in terms of that kind of nomenclature and principle, energy is what's going to help fuel performance. It's also what's going to help maintain structure, as Ray Pete would say. You need that structure, right? That tissue quality, and musculoskeletal qualities, all those kinds of things in order to actually function, right? And then your functionality is also going to feed into those other things and have inputs on your structure and energy demands and all that too. So that's kind of how I would look at things. We also tend to look at training as like an output, like a necessary withdrawal or red from your bank account, and really look at like a sort of a concurrent pyramid with that of like the deposits, right? And so we try to turn as much of the lifestyle of a person, this gets into that energy side of that energy structure function model. We try to get as much deposits going in there as possible, whether that's, correcting respiratory limitations and breathing, whether that's addressing deficiencies in someone's energy metabolism, needed and, changes in their environment, like getting sunlight, sleep, stuff like that, in order to make sure that they're actually adapting to the stimulus of training. And I know for you and me, that's not really a revelation to say, but I think for most people that's probably their biggest gap that they're lacking there, how those things connect to each other.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight, and I hope that everyone listening really takes that to heart. Ultimately, it is adaptation. If you're there in the gym or you're training, you're doing something, if you don't have any adaptation that comes from it, you're not going to be able to make progress towards your goals, and ultimately, it's a waste unless if you're trying to make any sort of athletic improvements. Of course, depends on your goals, but yes, that is a huge key. Can you talk a little more about your favorite ways to do that gap assessment? Because I think that's a very intelligent way to frame it up. Is we're only as strong as our weakest link, trying to figure out the weakest link, or as you said, fix that one pothole, go on to the next one. But can you talk about kind of how you go through that process of identifying gaps?
Yeah. So I usually like to do a combination of watching the athlete move in their natural environment. So that just kind of is like a fancy way to say I watch a lot of film. I also like to get hands-on and work with the person in front of me. And, I used to be one of those coaches that thinks that you have to have this whole long assessment that you need to put everybody through first, and then they go out. And to some extent that is true, but I just sort of look at what they need and think, all right, well, here's the reality. This is how much time I have them for. Let's focus on those things that matter the most, kind of get an assessment of those. Let's take the car out on the track a little bit just to see what they can and can't do on the court, in the cage, on the field, in life, right? As well as in the gym setting. And then from there, just kind of work backwards. Like, okay, this guy, this guy's got, the first role is keeping guys available, because the best ability is availability. This guy can't even stay on the court. Well, obviously that's going to be the first thing that I need to tackle there, right? And within that, okay, then I can see he's a bad mover. Maybe his right, do some PRI kind of table assessments. See that his right foot is maybe stuck in external rotation. It's kind of corrupting how his body interacts with the ground, which maybe is sending some energy up the chain, and his back's getting hurt, right? And that would be where some of that Todd Wright Gray Institute stuff kind of comes into play. And that's, basically how the athlete is dealing with physics, right? Gravity, mass, momentum, and those ground reaction forces is not working right. So he might not be, strong by some conventional metrics either, but the bigger thing for me in that is, all right, I need to do some structural repositioning just so this guy can move right, do some baseline sensory integration, sensory motor competency work. So this guy's actually got kind of like a nice, well integrated trunk, or kind of more of a functional way to do core training, make sure that he's actually able to just own his space on the field without pain. And even through that kind of mobility and training and whatnot, we're actually, that's kind of the secret is, mobility training is strength training, right? You are getting him stronger in there. And then later on, now I feel like I can do some stuff where I can really go after his vertical jump, let's say, and do so in a way that's not going to cause him not to be able to handle force as well and potentially be able, potentially get injured, right? And that's sort of like within that lens, that's kind of the other model I view performance through is an activation, absorption, propulsion model, right? And that's, if you can't, the word is activate, but I guess you could say facilitate, right? Sometimes you're inhibiting things. But anyways, if you don't have that baseline ability to use the right muscles in the right groups, the right time, and kind of link that chain, you're not going to be able to absorb force properly, so you could get injured. And if you can't absorb force properly, you're not going to be able to convert that force and transfer that energy in movement, right? So you're also going to limit your propulsive capacity as well. So I just kind of in there see, all right, where is this guy's limiter, and attack it from there, basically.
That's great. Very well said. That approach too, in business, there's a concept known as the theory of constraints, and that is the same sort of thing. If a clinic owner is listening to this and you think, okay, I've got all this capacity, but not enough people coming through the door. The constraint and complaint is lead generation. If there's a bunch of people coming through the door and they're booking a first session, but they're all falling off, not completing their plan of care, then there's a constraint related to fulfillment of services. There's something off in the way those services are being fulfilled, where people aren't wanting to stay and do more. So same thing with athletic performance. There's if someone has a biomechanical issue that's causing them to get injured, of course, that's a big constraint, right? And then, further on as you optimize, there's all these other things, mechanics of movement, endurance and energy. And then eventually then the speed of movement and the load they can tolerate, all that becomes a limiting factor. So you keep getting to add on those.
Right, exactly. And that's probably a more eloquent way to put it is like, it looks like, all right, I'm not doing as much traditional, stuff in this regard, but by putting a little bit more time spent in optimizing that big blind spot that they have athletically, the secret is I'm actually kind of going to improve all those other things, right, up the chain in performance. And then as I address this deficit, then I can spend, again, this is not to say we're not doing any, let's say, agility or plyo work in this case, but I'm better able to spend more time doing that later on. And in the meantime, I'm still improving them too. So I think that's one thing I'd like to impart on people listening is by making people more durable, strong, and resilient, better movers, you are going to improve traditional stuff too. Power, right? Rate of force development. What's the saying? Fast is fluid, fluid is fast, right? So I think that when you improve someone's ability to move and self-organize in space, the best athletes really are able to own their space. So you're going to improve their performance in that regard. And the analogy I like to use is with cars, right? Like conventional model, they put all the emphasis on the engine, whereas I'm putting emphasis on the engine and also the alignment and the steering fluid and the drivetrains of the car, as my friend Nick Simpson likes to say. And that's going to be a sports car, right? Because like technically like an 18-wheeler or a Hummer is going to have just as big, maybe sometimes a bigger engine than some of these sports cars. but is that really an athletic, or, you know what I'm saying? Is that really kind of like a fluidly driving car that's going to win a race? No. And so I think that you kind of have to work on both, right?
I like that. Fast is fluid, fluid is fast. And that, reminds me of course, a lot of the content I've seen you post, both the written content. I know you have that communications degree. You get very, very good writing. If people have a chance to look at your articles, and we'll share links and such. And then you also post content on social media and on different channels about exercises. And before we get into some of those techniques, in terms of fluidity and mechanics and this kind of pyramid of performance concept, can you share with us some of your thoughts, a little deeper in mechanics, some of your perspective approach related to the fascial system, fascial slings, and some of your perspective there? Because I think you have some good takes on that concept.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I basically, I'm working on kind of fleshing this out in a way that I can teach it to other coaches or athletes who want to learn. But I basically take kind of a neuro biomechanical approach to movement, and that's to be both inclusive of the software or the underlying neurological behavior, and then also the hardware, which traditionally is really only musculoskeletal emphasized, and fascia gives lip service, but it doesn't really like make it to the applied side of things. I think what people need to realize is that, your fascia is your largest sensory organ in the body, right? It interconnects organs, it interconnects muscle groups. It actually helps reposition the alignment of your bones and your structure, right? And the other thing people need to realize is it's highly, highly receptive to input, right? So when I feel stressed from life stress and I have a pain in my neck, that's actually, it's a multitude of things, but one of the key reasons why I'm feeling that is because of the sensory proprioceptors in the fascia itself, right? Muscle too, but again, fascia is the one that kind of interconnects the whole body. And you see it show up in things like acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine. They understood this, even if they didn't necessarily use the same terminology we do. But in kind of an athletic performance context, or like a rehab context as well, your fascia is also responsible for helping you with movement economy or efficiency of movement, right? And so because fascia is highly adaptable to input, most of us live in this linear world. We train in a way that doesn't really have any type of elasticity or movement variability. And so what happens is over time, the fascia dries up, it gets dehydrated, it calcifies. Your diet can also play a role in this, but when that happens, those sensory nerves, basically, they cut off access to that part of the body. And so only through integrating those concepts in training can you re-innervate the proprioceptors, the sensory nerves in the various parts of the fascial tissue. So then they show up in real time. So when you see me doing some of those movements with guys where we might be kind of almost like exaggerating, let's say for like a midline here, or exaggerating turns into that lead leg, right? If we're talking about kind of like, say, first step explosiveness.
So for people who are listening to this, just so everyone can kind of understand what you're talking about is examples of exercise where you're posting, videos and descriptions. And so something where someone might be lunging, but instead of just a straightforward or straight backwards lunge, they're lunging and then they're rotating over their legs. So they're getting this full body transverse plane movement, just so that type of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you pretend my legs are in a lunge here, right? My right leg is forward, I'm going to turn into that. So that way, what I'm getting is that natural, I'm going to exaggerate that turn, right? So I'm making sure I'm hydrating all of that fascial tissue, innervating all that fascial tissue. So then it shows up when I'm not exaggerating too, right? When I run, I'm getting the horizontal push-pull spiral actions that are needed in literally all movements. Whereas, most coaches, unfortunately, especially in America, teach running is this linear, and most movement is this linear endeavor, right? They don't really let the anatomy of it all inform their training, which is, I think, what Thomas Myers was getting at. And that's why he called his book literally Anatomy Trains, right? It's a physiology trains too, but also anatomy trains, right? Those are the things that should inform our decisions, not tradition or, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So what does a session with you look like in terms of how you balance this? I mean, obviously, you're doing a gap assessment, right? You're figuring out what an athlete's needs are, but are you can you kind of talk about how you might work these movements in, or if there's like I mean, do you have a movement prep and then
Yeah.
strength or speed, or like, can you talk about kind of where the rubber meets the road, how you would work that into an individual session?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, the politician's answer would be it depends, right? So, if I'm working with someone who has neurodegeneration, it's going to be probably super basic. We're probably using, the NeuFit for a good chunk of that work that we're doing as well. And they may not be able to pull off some of those other things. But let's assume someone has an everyday person, they've got like some solid enough bill of health. We're looking at doing like myofascial release, which ideally they're doing on their own to actually help, you know, decompress or break up adhesions, things like that in the tissue. We're doing some decompression and some work on the ground. We do a lot of ground work early on. We call it developmental on ground program, which again is something from Todd Wright. I took from Todd Wright with the Clippers and 76ers. And that's basically just a lot of ground-based movement and corrective exercise. The better you get at that kind of locomotion, the better you're going to get standing, the better you're going to move standing up, right?
And so that's essentially working through the developmental patterns like rolling, crawling, like things that we learn as kids in order to progress towards walking, like those types of things.
Yeah, definitely that. And then sometimes it's honestly just corrective exercises that happen to be on the ground, like some PRI, joint repositioning kind of stuff. And then usually after we do that, again, it's usually a combination of activation, some structural repositioning where someone needs it. Let's say some hip internal rotation, maybe triggering the fascia a bit, the fascia that we're going to need to see show up later in the session. We then kind of progress to being on foot, right? And so pretty much every athlete is going to have some type of or multiple types of core exercises, but not your classic like crunches or twist a med ball on the ground kind of stuff. We make sure that we also do core exercises standing up, right? Sometimes it can also be just positional isometrics and things like that to reinforce good positions. But the idea being that with your trunk, right, all the functional anatomy of the core that hooks into your pelvis. I mean, the whole trunk, as Serge Grakovetsky has shown, he's a Canadian sports scientist, he's shown in his book and his work, The Spinal Engine, is that your trunk is the origin of all movement, of all energy, of all power, right? In America, they teach it wrong and they say, oh, your legs are what propels it. And then the trunk is just, brace your core, it's along for the ride. But the reality is, that is brace your core is a good cue for certain movements in the gym, like let's say for a power lifter on a back squat. But the reality is your trunk, it needs tensegrity. It needs to have the fascia needs to be well developed, so and the muscles, so it has that intermuscular and myofascial coordination, some good quality balance between length and tension. But in a movement sense, it's purely rotary, right? And anyways, whether it's going up to dunk a basketball, whether it's running, whatever, the energy from the trunk gets transferred down the chain into the ground. You're reacting, or excuse me, the athlete has to deal with things like mass, momentum, gravity, ground reaction forces. And then how that foot interacts with the ground is going to basically see that those same forces, that energy, come back up the chain. And so if you're holistically developing that kinetic chain with, of course, the right, load, velocity, stuff like that too, you're going to see those forces get accurately dispersed throughout the chain, versus if you do not do that, you are going to see those forces more than likely get dispersed to one muscle group or one joint or one tissue area, right? God forbid, knee, ankle is a common one, especially in basketball. A lower back pain is another one, right? So that's one way to also kind of view movement holistically, rather than just saying, oh, this guy just needs to activate this, glute med and then he'll be good. He just needs to do some band walks and then we'll, take the car out on the track and he'll be fine. So that's what we'll do for that piece of things. And then depending on where the athlete's at, if it's in season, off season, how many minutes they're playing, things like that, we'll progress into things like strength work, which I know you wanted to talk about because we do some of that a little differently, and then also or agility, plyometric velocity work. So I would say we do take kind of like a Louis Simmons conjugate model in that regard. We'll have days that are more based on twitching and ballistic dynamic plyometric sprinting, velocity kind of work. And then we have other days that are more based around, strength, power development. And, to steal a quote from you, rehab is sort of woven throughout the whole thing, right? If we're loading someone, we're making sure that they're being loaded in a way that's general, that it's going to transfer to the sport, or we're loading it in a way that's it's going to reinforce their locomotion and their locomotive capabilities, right? I would say, not that this is wrong to do for all athletes or whatever, but we're really not doing like barbell back squats and stuff. We might do like a well-positioned hex bar deadlift with our feet inside of our columns, our power center, but we don't do a ton of traditional strength training, I would say. But that's sort of how we would progress, right? You get in there, you get warmed up, and then we gradually progress them to the main event.
Have you picked up your copy of the Newfit Method yet? In this book, Garrett helps you reconnect with the nervous system and improve outcomes at every stage of rehab and fitness. Based on Garrett's proprietary Newfit methodology and newbie technology, the solutions in this book will introduce you to a framework for overcoming virtually any physiological challenge. Take the first step in enhancing recovery, boosting performance, and optimizing health in ways you never thought possible. Now available on Amazon in hardback, paperback, or Kindle. And now, back to the show.
That's good. Great. A lot of great insights woven in throughout there. Thank you for that. And before we move on from the topic of fascia and these different trains or slings, can you talk a little bit about something that I know is a topic near and dear to your heart, but the posterior chain or the posterior fascial sling, and how that's related to performance, the importance of it, and then a little bit about how you would work in some training that emphasizes that too.
Yeah. I should also say before too, one thing that's included in a lot of our sessions, you're technically always doing proprioception work, right? Because you're constantly feeding information into your proprioceptive system, and then the body's adapting accordingly, right? So, but we do a good amount of proprioception work too, and foot training. Actually, you just heard me mention the importance of how the foot interacts with the ground, and I think a lot of people don't realize that proprioception also impacts body control too, and activation and relaxation, and how you engage or disengage, your whole chain as a unit. So we do a good amount of proprioceptive work. Sometimes, all of our guys are training barefoot most sessions, I would say. We also do things like the WAF, proprioceptive pad, and that's not just to improve how the foot maps force on the ground, but also for activation work, for positional ownership, right? Being able to own certain positions and find sensory familiarity in them, especially at crazy sporting angles. And then also just to get more strength and body control. And then to answer your other question about the posterior chain, I think most people train it in kind of a fragmented way. They're doing kind of like a traditional deadlift, things like that. But the posterior chain, you really need to think about it. If you look at the posterior myofascial line, it's going, from, you can't see me reaching here, but I'm reaching low on my leg, all the way up through to, literally like the back of your head. And so when you see sporting events, whether that's a baseball player pitching, whether that's a basketball player going up for a dunk, that whole posterior chain it not only needs to be, the parts need to be engaged, but it also needs to be able to fire and orchestrate in sequence. And so that includes getting the muscles developed. That also includes doing some slinging type things, or very, almost like people think of the kettlebell swing. So think of that, but just a bunch of different movement possibilities using those same slinging type principles. And that way you're better able to elastically transfer force using much more of your back chain. Your front chain, right? You want the core to be involved, of course, but we want to try to minimize the amount of work that my quad is doing, because when the quad comes along for the ride, then the knee comes along for the ride too, right? And you need to strengthen your quads. They need to be involved, but you really don't need to make them a point of emphasis in most types of training. You really should be focusing on a lot of the supportive muscle groups, right? Because most athletes are going to work their quads plenty on their own, right? They don't need extra reinforcement there.
And a lot of athletes, I mean, is kind of a natural corollary to what you just said, that a lot of athletes are excessively quad dominant or push too much into the ground instead of pulling and using that back chain. Is that a fair kind of restatement or conclusion?
Yeah. And I can even stand up if that's okay and show like an example. So yeah, I would say not only is there kind of like a lack of emphasis there in training, but also like this would be an example of structure dictating function, but in terms of and how they interrelate, but joint repositioning too, right? You'll see a lot of people, sorry for the noise, but they'll have that anterior, pelvic tilt. It's actually okay to have a little bit of that for athletes, believe it or not, but you'll see where their pelvis is so tilted in an anterior capacity, it's really limiting the engagement of the hamstrings, and vice versa, right? Like the lack of hamstring ability the lack of development in the hamstring also causes an anterior pelvic tilt. But yeah, so you could see how that's going to make someone overload their quads and knees a bit more, be more susceptible to back pain, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really, really important topic. And again, just in that very foundational, all this is still not necessarily sports specific. This is general movement, dexterity, motor control, in that base of the pyramid. And there's a lot of work to be done here for a lot of athletes. When we're talking about that gap assessment or training the gaps, that's a big area. We spend a lot of time working on that.
For sure, yeah. You can do multiple podcasts on just that. I mean, that's kind of, we're talking different models to use through which to see these things. I think that's one of them too, is like a lot of the athletes that I use are doing some of the same stuff, and they branch out where necessary for their sport. But these are principles, and that's that we're human first, athlete second, sport specific third, right? I know my buddy Paul Favorite says that. Now I can't remember where I already said that, but basically, right, like if you improve any of those foundational biomechanical things we evolved to do, like walking, running, jumping, throwing, punching, maybe basic loaded carries and stuff like that, you're going to improve everything up the chain too, right? Like I've had athletes who come in and they are impressive in some ways with their strength and whatnot. They can put up a bunch of numbers in the gym, but they can't sprint without their hamstring cramping, right? And it's like, your training is probably what you're currently doing is probably taking you further away from elite performance instead of nudging you toward it. And that's why a lot of these athletes need to go in and do some of this general stuff, to like the general work capacity stuff, or to build up their movement literacy and their sensory motor competencies that are going to transfer out elsewhere. And that, speaking of people who I've learned a good amount from, that's where our mutual friend Justin Rippey, I would say, can deserve some credit there.
Yeah, for sure. I think those are the big themes: movement literacy, motor competency. I think those are great, probably even more illustrative words to describe kind of what I mean by that base of the pyramid. I really like that term. Little bit more in this realm of movement literacy before we move on there. Let's see. So proprioception, can you talk to us a little more? I mean, you mentioned the importance of fascia, how innervated it is, a lot of sensory nerves there. You talked about how when you see these different positions, talked a little bit about the WAF. I know you have a lot that you're doing in there. What else are some of the main points of emphasis or go-to techniques for you in terms of this notion of increasing proprioception in order to inform and improve movement literacy?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned earlier, everything you're doing is proprioception. So it's like, I don't want my inputs from the environment to be something that's going to like potentially dampen my like the proprioceptive ability I need for the sport. Right. And so a lot of traditional training will do things like proprioceptively that might dampen your your ability to play on the court, right? Like you might mess up your ability to be elastic and your stretch shortening cycle and things like reciprocal inhibition, or your ability for one muscle to relax while the other contracts. If you're doing an excess of movements where you're getting a lot of co-contraction and muscling through movements and not being as elastic, right? Force informs fascia, so you need to be training, like instead of going like high load, no velocity, most athletes need to be doing more work where they're going high velocity, lower load as well. You need to be doing, and again, the amount to which you need both varies, and with training age, younger athletes are going to need, more of one than older athletes would be. So you need to keep that stuff in mind when you're kind of like thinking about exercise selection
and also also that gap assessment. Some guys are going to be a lot faster, need more strength. Some guys are going to be a lot stronger and need more, guys and girls. So you can be a lot stronger and need more speed work. So that, that plays into that too, and needs of the sport.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I would say that, so we might do a lot of like isometric type holds in certain positions. There's a guy named Aaron Jesse out of the Institute for Sport and Medicine, and I believe that's it, in Boston. Anyways, we do a lot of this like kind of musculo-systemic engineering stuff, where we're actually doing some of these super slow movements while we're maybe we're grouping together various parts of the body we want to see show up in movement. So I did a post recently, for example, where I'm standing on the WAF. I'm having an athlete, a basketball player, stand on the WAF proprioceptive pads in a defensive stance, right? And so he has a band around his knees. He's also trying to high five the wall with his glutes, so he's getting pretty low. He also has his hands overhead like he's contesting a shot, and then he's being given certain cues by me, and of course like the band and the positionality of the whole thing. So that way, when he's in that position on the court, instead of coach saying, hey, get into his body, move this way, do that, those are all left brain logical neck up cues. And some athletes might get that, some athletes might not. So this is a way for me to kinesthetically cue the athlete without him having to think about those things, right? Because if you can't think, like you can, but you can't like think your way through movements and expect to be a great player in sports, because sports are won and lost on fractions of a second, right? So I'm able to kinesthetically speak to the athlete in their own language, and through felt perception, make these things show up, whether it's structural repositioning, whether it's activating something, getting those sensory motor competencies built up to where they're just going to show up on the court. So when then he's going to try to lock a guy down now, he's no longer in his front chain. He's no longer just sort of stuck on his heels, getting blown by. His hips are more engaged, his glutes are more engaged, his force is mapping, his feet are mapping the force right. And then thanks to, just to use this as an easy example for people to see, him being on the WAFs is going to make sure that he has that full body CNS activation. He's activating small intrinsic muscles he wasn't using before. So then he's completely, like a central nervous system and like the tissues that we want to see show up are fully engaged, right? So that would be like just one example. I think that was more of an example than an answer to your question, but I think people kind of learn better that way.
Yeah, for sure. And so just so everybody knows, when Coop is talking about the WAFs, the WAF, WAFF, are these discs that create this unstable surface. So people might look at it as like a balanced disc or similar to a Bosu ball, but it's different structurally. And I know you found a lot of value in those. Can you just tell people a little bit, just describe them a little more so people understand, and then also share your thoughts on how that, kind of the transfer between that unstable surface training into sport, because there's some interesting links on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We could almost have like a whole little like what toys and technology do you use sort of little like section too in that. So yeah, basically with the WAFs, like old proprioceptive pads in the past, basically were all reactive surface, right? And the material wasn't really great either. They're good for some things, right? Like for example, a Bosu ball can be good to like, if I'm running and want to do a little push off action there. If some people do some interesting stuff where they like load it for like landmines, like to kind of like pattern some, get the foot in the right position. You can do good stuff with all these toys. It's just, it's context, right? So with the WAP, there's a central spine and then a reactive surface. So you get the right blend of, stability and mobility. So I could stand on like an RX pad or something like that and see my foot collapse in a valgus capacity. And that could really potentially put someone in a bad position that might reinforce an injury. At the same time, with WAF, what I'm able to do is kind of naturally auto-correct things and put people in better positions. The material is such where it creates a quicker proprioceptive like feedback loop, or a quicker reflex arc, rather sensory reflex arc, to improve reflexes and speed of co-contraction around a joint, things like that. So yeah, we definitely do those for our reactive. Those are our bread and butter for our like reactive surface training with proprioception. We also just have guys go barefoot, as I mentioned before. We will do some other things too, just for, again, proprioception training, at least as it relates to the foot or surface manipulation. We'll do like slant boards. We'll do a little bit of like balance discs, things like that. I think that with proprioception training, there's a tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because we've all seen the videos of dudes doing barbell back squats on a yoga ball and dumb stuff like that, or people just doing curls on a BOSU ball, like just to make it more intense. So that's kind of made a lot of people allergic to it. But what I would say is that, we've all seen coaches cue squats the wrong way and they've hurt people, but we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater there, or with battle ropes, or with anything else, right? So why is it that this one modality has that done to it, So it's just kind of interesting to me how people are super dogmatic there, and I've kind of tried to help nudge that aspect of the industry along forward a little bit more. But yeah, I think there's times where you want a stable surface, right? Most of the time, 99% of the time in a training session, we are on a stable surface, right? But when you introduce the other one, you're improving all the different sensory systems. You can do some interesting ocular motor work or vision work there. And you're also able to do some vestibular work there too, right? So the vestibular system is part of what's going to help athletes basically, let's say if you're running, right, your vestibular system sees your environment, the ground around you, and it codes in kind of an anticipatory muscle tone so that you're better able to prepare for those ground reaction forces, right? So proprioceptive, the main when we say proprioception, we're usually talking about is sort of the reactive system, right? I need to react to my environment, but you're also getting information fed about your environment too. And so in training, whether it's with these tools or not, you can try to stimulate different aspects here, whether it's, your plyometrics, simple plyometrics, right? And agility work, altitude drops, balance work on these different things. So we intermix it to try to help activate the CNS, help different tissues show up, help with positional ownership, help try to mimic elements of a dynamic environment that the athlete is going to see on the court too. That's one thing that, in that article I wrote, Fabrice's athletes have said is that, hey, like technically the surface is stable and we want to do most of our training there, but in a live environment, that it's anything but. Your foot's not always going to land in that perfect scenario training, or actually perfect scenario controlled environment, right? So sometimes you need to incorporate some of these unpredictable elements into training too. And the last thing I'll say on that is that this pretty good outlet called Sports Injury Bulletin just did a whole research review on the foot and how it's it needs that variability in training in order to stay healthy. I mean, there's a meta-analysis too. I think can't remember how many studies it was, but it showed that even poorly designed proprioception training using old technology and a hodgepodge of methods reduced injuries by 40%. And you combine that with strength training, it was 70%. In a meta-analysis, that's like the gold standard, because it's like liquid gold when it comes to research, because it's a bunch of studies grouped together. It's not just, over extrapolating one single study, right?
Yeah, for sure. Can you send me a link to that? Actually, I'll follow up with you, but it'd be good to share an article on that. I'd also like to share an article where you were writing about these WAFs tools or discs, and mentioned Fabrice. Fabrice's name, we'll mention Fabrice Gauthier is a really brilliant French osteopath, and he came over to start working with a lot of their NBA players. So he's there in the LA area, and I know you mentioned his name at the time or two. So he's a really great practitioner there. Got a cool spot in Beverly Hills now too.
He's got more like the North Bay, like Beverly Hills. I'm more the South Bay, closer to the airport. So
Yes,
he's he's a PT osteopath. So you've got the like, those are things that I don't do, right? Like I do kind of like the post rehab or reconditioning, right? So that's another thing too, is I think it's important to be able to find a team that all speaks the same language, and you have someone there that you can communicate to about these things, whether it's just a familiar have that, what do you call it, competency in another area, so you can know that what you're doing is positively impacting that area, or vice versa. So it's always good to, I think, just check your ego at the door and know that you don't know things. And I think that's one thing that I would leave for other strength and conditioning coaches too, is, hey, your main goal is to keep guys on the floor, and you see them probably, the most or right up there. So you want to make sure that that information you're coding into them is going to make sure they're staying on the court, right? And so to do that, I think the training staff and the medical staff have to really be pretty good friends.
Yeah, heck yeah, that's very well said. I would just nothing to add there other than to I agree, and I want to underscore, underline, bold, italicize that. That was great. Very, very well said.
I should say too that real quick, just for other proprioceptive tools too, right? A lot of it is just like kinesthetic cues, right? Like I might take like a pair of like pro pulsers or like egg weights and have guys hold them while they run, so their arms tear through the air, right? And they get that rotary aspect of movement. We might do just simple resistance bands tied around someone in a way that's going to help them reposition their rib cage and do and help them decompress, right? We might use an aqua bag to do, or a Viper to do some loaded movement. So that way the brain, having this loaded cue, it then is, when you remove the cue, it's better able to self-organize in space because it's used to having that cue, which may trigger something like, like a lordosis of the spine when you're running, or, getting your midline to kick in when you're running too, right? So anyways,
Yes.
I usually say there's no bad tools or technology. There's just dumb ways to use them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And on that, I mean, that's very good. You can be intentional. Adding load will create more input and will reinforce whatever you're doing. So if you're using that to help cue someone or drive someone into a better position, that gives them a chance to learn that and to learn it faster because of the increased load. And speaking of tools and increased load and increased input, that brings me, I got to ask you for your thoughts on how you're using the newbie in this realm here, in this strength and conditioning optimization, some return to play, like you mentioned in these different scenarios. What are your kind of your thoughts and your areas where you've seen the newbie make the biggest impact in the realms that we're talking about here today?
Yeah, so definitely shortening the gap on rehab time and closing that gap, I would say, is one of the main things that I've used it for, right? Like I mentioned before, I'll check in with PTs and stuff if someone's working with a PT, and we regularly lap recovery times, sometimes as much as like 30 or 70%, and that's with the newbie dosed in there. So definitely in shortening that return to play time and improving some of these sensory motor competencies. I would say that, I think you said it before, and I think Corey Schlesinger of the Phoenix Suns has said it too. And, your way of saying it was, you're never doing just rehab and performance, you're doing both. And he says, a rehab program and a training program should look really similar, right? And so that's kind of how the newbie slots into what I do, is we use it to help keep guys healthy and to improve performance, right? We also use it to improve some of the things we talked about today, like activation, right? To help guys reduce the amount of time they are injured, if they are injured in the first place, or just ideally prevent them from getting injured just in the first place, right? So that might mean putting pad placements on areas we want to see emphasized more, right? Like various parts of the your glutes, right? It might mean placing them on the hamstring, so we're getting someone more back chain dominant. We might also, especially if I'm working with someone who's kind of needs to do more recovery or something like that, we might do it for more of kind of like a master, like one of the master resets, right? I'll also use it for like to improve cross crawl reflex, like your reciprocal contralateral reciprocation. So I might try to get this opposite midline here queued up with this opposite glute, right? And we'll do things too where we kind of do like loosening or opening up protocols with it, where we'll turn it up to just like a super low sensation and have guys move through it. And we've seen a lot of really good results doing that. And it was kind of I won't name, out of respect to privacy, of course, for the parties involved. I won't name any names, but it was kind of a full circle moment with the NeuFit recently too, because I remember when I had first moved down here, very shortly after I first started using the NeuFit in my own practice. But I was talking to a couple like NBA front offices, like there was a specific injured athlete at the time who's well known, and was talking about his agent and stuff like that. And then at the time it was like too forward thinking, so like they kind of they were like, oh, this is just regular E-stim. They kind of looked at me like I was from outer space when I was talking about some of this other stuff. It was sort of like, it's just whatever, it's just one of these other things. And then later on, come to find out more recently in a conversation with you, it's now that same athlete in that same group put the NeuFit in such a high priority there, and so to be involved with that and to see it go from like, it's almost like the Henry Ford model, right? With like, oh, they don't they think they want faster horses, I'm giving them a new car. So to see that whole process in real time, going from being one of the first people out here in California showing it to people, to now being able to use it with these same pro athletes and have them kind of know what it is and want it to be part of their program is pretty cool to see. But anyways, yeah, it's kind of a fun anecdote.
That's cool. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It's fun to see the evolution, and first people many are naturally resistant to new things and are skeptical with good reason, because there's a lot of stuff that comes out that that doesn't work or doesn't do what it claims to do. And so we understand the skepticism, but it is cool to see those breakthroughs where people who initially had resisted, or when they kind of come around and start to see those outcomes, that's really cool. And then something you mentioned there, and all those uses of the newbie, I think it was very well said. One that I just thought is an interesting point of emphasis when you talk about, if you want someone to engage a certain muscle more, and more glute, more hamstring, or whatever you put it on there, it is a little different than a traditional output-based electrical stimulation approach, where you're not just putting it on in order to necessarily contract that muscle, you're putting it on in order to create more of that proprioceptive input, right in line with what you've been talking about the importance of proprioception, these different ways, different strategies for doing that. You're trying to create that input so that athlete's brain essentially is more aware of that part of their body and can call upon it and can activate it better for themselves, as opposed to just relying on this machine as kind of a crutch to do it for them. They're actually, by creating that input, you're enabling them, you're teaching them, you're improving their motor competency or their movement literacy, as you said, so that they can call upon that area themselves and learn to do it faster and learn to do it even when they're not on the machine. So I think that's an interesting kind of connection there, and way to tie together some of the other things you brought up.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think people should, for sure, they should think of one of the things newbie does. I mean, of course, when I'm putting the pad there, I'm also getting improved circulation. I'm improving, I believe. I think I just saw, I don't know if it was you posted a study on this. I think it helps the tissue's ability to utilize oxygen appropriately. And I think all those things are kind of combined, right? You see that show up in some of those like Moxy muscle oxygen sensors. They're almost kind of a stand-in for EMG, right? It's like you see that the tissue better utilizing oxygen. You put an EMG in its place, you're going to see the same thing. Whereas if it's like low, like a lower grade on one, you're going to see it show up as a low grade on the other, right? So I think in addition to all those things, people should just think of the newbie as a way to kind of provide additional kinesthetic cues for the athlete. So that way, when you remove the cue, like on the court or on the field or, in real life, you're going to see those things show up, right? I think also decompression is another thing I forgot to mention that most people don't realize it can help with too. Can
you tell us a little more about that, about just how you see it helping in that regard?
Yeah. So, one of the main things for decompression and just feeling safe in your own environment is going to be, all of your sensory inputs collectively, nutritionally, your life, how you live, stuff like that. But physically here, like having a nice midline stability is really important. So you'll see us putting like balls under guys' armpits, putting electrodes from the NeuFit here too, and actually kind of creating a bigger frame. Most of us have much bigger frames than we realize, but we kind of have this small presence, the tissues get shriveled, the structures start to get compressed. Most of us are a bit longer and taller than we realize. And so we'll do that and have guys, do things like stand at attention. We'll have maybe tie some biofeedback resistance bands, loop them around the feet and over here to feed that dysfunction. So it naturally makes us correct against it, right? So we'll do that with the NeuFit in certain areas we want to sync up, and also just to get some sensory awareness there around that midline, which is going to see guys get stronger, longer, right? And then just generally kind of feel more fluid in their environment. It's great for pain relief too. But that's a lot of the stuff Dr. Eric Cobb and my boy MoveMed, they talk a lot about that. It's just, they do, that stuff as it relates to vision and all those inputs that you're giving yourself, you could talk about that in different ways, right? Is that stuff going to show up on the court and the field and limit performance if you're not feeling safe in that environment? Absolutely, right? At the same time, it's also going to show up in life too. So, from a performance input standpoint, from having a robust energy metabolism, from your diet standpoint, you're going to need, the body's going to need to feel safe and relaxed to perform at a high level. Similar to how you see with pregnant women, right? Like the most energetically expensive thing to do for a woman is to have a baby, right? So that's why it's harder to get pregnant if you're in a super duper caloric deficit. You don't have an abundance of energy. So in that context, it's a different type of performance, but your body needs to feel relaxed, and the relaxed state is a high energy state. So, it's all about making sure that your environment and the inputs you're feeding it, both through training, or your withdrawals, right? Or your deposits, diet, light exposure, sleep, stuff like that, are combining to give you that right energy balance.
Yes, very well said there. I think that both wraps up, puts a nice bow on some of the topics there, and also opens up potentially some others. But I think we'll have to save some of those other ones for a part two here. So as we wind down this part one, can you let people listening know how to find you? Best place to look you up on website, articles that you publish, social media. What are the best channels and best places to keep up with you and your work?
Yeah, so you can find me on at my website, which is basically a fossil, but I'm slowly but surely updating it, and that's rewireperformance.com. You can reach out there if you want to work with me. You can also go to Instagram and find me at RewireHP or Rewire Health and Performance. I'm not as active on Twitter. I do have a at Rewire HP Twitter account. I believe that's the little tag for it. And then if you wanted to read stuff I've done, you can always go to Just Fly Sports. Simply Faster, I've done some articles for them. And if you wanted to, ask me about any of the tools we talked about today, you can obviously go to NeuFit, and then you can go to WAFFstudio.com as well.
Those are good. The Just Simply Faster and Just Fly both are really good websites. Generally, and go in there and searching by your name for the articles you've written. Those are really good resources. So I'm glad you mentioned those, and we'll put them in the notes as well.
Cool. Yeah, I'm almost hesitant to like any writer, right? I don't like referencing stuff I've already done, because it's oh, my understanding of that's changed. Like I feel like a dumbass, but oh well. It's I think you can still get a lot out of those, even if they need a little bit of an update. And I have a brand new article coming out soon on Just Fly on proprioception and basically sensory integration work.
We'll give Joel a plug too on Just Fly. He's got really good books, resources, and good content there. And as do you. Excellent conversation here. Thank you for that, and really good online resources that we'll point to. And I'll just end by saying thank you very much. Thanks for coming on, sharing your wisdom and perspective. And I imagine people listening got a lot out of it, whether it be some techniques or shifts in perspective and different frameworks that you're using here. I think you have a very thorough and effective way of looking at performance and helping athletes improve. So thanks for coming on and sharing it with us.
Yeah, you bet, man. Appreciate you having me.
Heck yeah. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We will see you on the next episode of the Undercurrent Podcast.
Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review and be sure to subscribe to stay up to date as we release future episodes.